Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our noon keynote event here at the Alaska Forum. We're very happy to be able to have our keynote guest here with us. And first thing, we have a little bit of business to do. First, to remind everybody that about our safety procedures, and just pay attention to the slides up there, up on the screen. They'll illustrate better than I can what to do. But again, if there's an earthquake, you need to find cover. And when it's time to evacuate, the closest exits are through these doors here. Just again as a reminder, one thing that isn't in the app or in the program is going on on the first floor. It's regarding the ANWR coastal plain, and at 2 and 5 o'clock there are presentations about the ANWR proposed development and opportunity for public comment. So there's something in addition to what you'll see in your agendas and programs if you're interested. And again, that's on the first floor. Today, we're going to take the first few minutes before our keynote and provide our Green Star Program awards. I'll ask Doug Mutter and Doug Huntman if you would come up and help us issue these awards.
You get double Doug today at lunch. Kurt says I'm his boss, so if you have any complaints about the way he parts his hair or his lame jokes, see me, okay? So welcome to the Alaska Forum on the Environment Keynote Luncheon and Green Star Community Awards Ceremony. Over the past year, the Green Star Community Programs traveled to remote communities and assisted them in the goal of reducing environmental impact and restructuring their practices to think green. This year, we're awarding 5 communities that have completed the process to earn their Green Star Award. The core Green Star Award program focuses on aspects of operations, examining all waste streams, eliminating waste through smarter purchasing, restructuring employee procedures, maintaining or updating equipment, and recycling. By meeting the Green Star community standards, these communities can demonstrate to the public that they have gone well beyond compliance with environmental regulations and have voluntarily implemented a thorough waste prevention and pollution prevention plan. If you look at your agenda on pages 34 and 35, you'll see a list of the communities that have earned an award this year. Our first community to receive the Green Star Award is the Evacuation. Yeah, what you said. So if we've got a representative from Evacuation, please come forward and receive your award. Is that her? No? No representative? Who?
Julia or John?
Julia or John here?
Oh, there they are.
Oh, there they are. There's no one here after that.
Was that all?
No, the cow skags aren't.
Our second community to receive the Green Star Award is Akiak. Someone from Akiak here? Who are we looking for? Here they come. Let's give them a hand. the third community to receive the Green Star Award is Napaimute. Anyone from Napaimute here today? Yes.
Yeah, just say that no one was here to accept the award of the Green Star Program.
Hey, Doug. Hello. Thank you.
You. Excellent. Yeah. Sure, I can hold this in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, very nice. Look at that. Thank you.
Thanks.
We had fourth and fifth community, Lower Calskag and Upper Calskag also won, but I don't believe there's anyone here from those communities. Is that right? I don't see anyone jumping up. Anyway, let's give them a hand too for winning. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, please. So one of the Dougs here is my boss. The other Doug Huntman was working with us and helped those 5 communities through the Green Star program this past year. And he's just recently launched his own business, Delta Backhaul. So he quit the Alaska Forum, and yet we're still talking, so it's fine. We won't hold any grudges. This is the last time you'll be on stage here, though. So at this point, I'd like to get off to start with our keynote by an introduction from Barb Schrader. Barb is one of our planning committee members and here with the U.S. Forest Service.
Hello, and welcome back to Forum for some folks, and welcome if this is the first time that you've been here. Thanks for joining us. We have, I'm seeing the PowerPoint here, so we have a good presentation coming up. Today we have Daniel Schindler with us. Daniel is a professor of aquatic and fisheries sciences in the College of the Environment at the University of Washington in Seattle. And that is quite a mouthful. Dr. Schindler conducts research in aquatic ecosystems and teaches classes, including limnology, and I like this one, Fish 101, Water and Society. It's important. Dr. Schindler is leading a team of researchers studying aquatic ecosystems in Southwest Alaska. They're investigating factors affecting our fisheries, including carbon dynamics, nutrients and food webs, watersheds, and people, as well as the role climate change may play in current and future scenarios. So, Dr. Schindler, would you like to come up and share a lot of your information with us, please?
All right, thank you for the invitation. It's a distinct honor to be invited to come speak with you today, especially with so many people who have come in from out of town and come to this conference to learn from each other, and hopefully you'll take something away from my presentation today. If you need to leave in a hurry, there is an exit here that might be useful. Yeah, so the what I'm going to talk about today is basically a body of work that we have learned about regarding how special Alaska's rivers are. The group I work with at the University of Washington started work in Alaska in the 1940s. This was before Alaska was a state, of course, and there were no universities in Alaska. And it was the commercial fishing industry who came to our university and said, you know what, we're concerned that we're taking too many fish. And what they wanted to do was establish a research program that Had Alaska had universities at the time, they probably would have gone to Alaska, but they came to Washington instead. Since the 1940s, we've maintained field camps throughout Bristol Bay, out at Chinook, on the peninsula, and what I'm going to talk about today is really what have we learned after 75 years of scientific study on Alaska rivers. So to put some context into this, I want to start by looking at a map of the world's biodiversity. This is for plants, okay, and we can make a similar map for just about any organism, but if we look at Alaska up here, it's yellow. There are not a lot of species up here. So if people talk about how important conservation of species is, we rarely talk about Alaska when we're considering the global stage. And that's simply because Alaska's at northern latitudes. There are not a lot of species here. If we look at threats to ecosystems and to human health, these are also global assessments. The top panel is threats to freshwater biodiversity. And you can see that Alaska looks nice and blue here, which means that in general, at the global scale, the risks to Alaska's freshwater ecosystems are considered to be relatively minor. Similarly, we can look at threats to human water supply. Obviously, there are many places of the world that don't have enough water or don't have clean access to clean water. Alaska in general is not one of them. It's nice and blue here. Things are relatively in relatively good condition compared to, say, sub-Saharan Africa, even Europe, and much of the lower 48. So it would be easy to get complacent and say, well, Alaska's in good shape. And I guess part of my argument today is that even though Alaska is relatively species poor, there are not a lot of species here, if you ask how important are each of those individual species to the ecosystems that they're part of, or to the people that live in those ecosystems, the argument is that each species is disproportionately more important here in Alaska than probably most places of the world. So that's one of the reasons why Alaska is, I think, interesting and important at a global scale. I work on water and fisheries, and in the developed world, where it's North America or Europe, Alaska is one of the places that still has, I will call, real connections between renewable resources like fisheries and people, both in terms of economy, in terms of livelihood, in terms of cultural identity. There are very few places left in the world where those, the strengths of those interactions are as important as they are here in Alaska. So it's unique for those perspectives too. And if we look at fisheries globally, you know, most places would love to have the fisheries that Alaska does. And this is not only in terms of how many fish are harvested from rivers and from the ocean, but also the state of the habitat, the state of the management system. When people ask about what are good management systems to use as models for how management of fisheries could occur, they often point to Alaska. There are issues that we need to work out, and the process that is used here in Alaska, I believe, is fairly efficient in making sure that most stakeholders have a voice, and there's an agency in charge of most of the fisheries that, in general, does a pretty good job. So if we look at, this is Bristol Bay sockeye salmon, which is mostly what I work on, and we can see, you know, the commercial fishery, well, first of all, people have been catching sockeye salmon in Bristol Bay for thousands of years, and that subsistence component of the economy and in terms of cultural identity is still there and going strong. But on top of that are the commercial fisheries and the sport fisheries. And here we're looking at the sport fishery, or sorry, not the sport fishery, the returns to the commercial fishery and to the escapement for Bristol Bay sockeye. Since the 1960s, the data are not quite as good for earlier in the 20th century, but what you see here is that the system, despite being harvested at a very heavy rate for over 120 years, still is producing as many fish as it probably ever did. In fact, the record return was last year, 2018, after more than a century of heavy commercial harvest. So we can ask ourselves, how can that be? You know, if you read the media, you hear nothing more than one fishery collapse after another fishery collapse, et cetera, as you scan across the world. But in Alaska, fisheries are sustainable. And the question is, why is that? Some of that is management. And the argument today is that I'll make is that a lot of it is a function of the fact that the habitat is intact, the habitat is productive, and the habitat is forgiving. Management can make mistakes, and the habitat will soak up the difference and allow sustainable fisheries to persist. If we look at Bristol Bay sockeye as one example, what I'm showing here is the total returns since the 1960s, and in different colors are the returns of fish to different rivers. And what you can see is that in the 60s and early 70s, this yellow color dominated. This was the Nushagak River, and you can see that all the other colors were tiny producers. Very few fish were returning to those rivers. If we had come to Bristol Bay with big development plans in the 1960s, it would have been really easy to prioritize the Nushagak River and consider all those other rivers as expendable. They just simply didn't produce many fish. Of course, that's not what happened. The habitat is largely intact, but look at what happened in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Now we have this smorgasbord of colors, okay? The yellow, the Nushagak, actually almost went away in the early 90s, and in fact, right now we have this broad range of different rivers contributing to overall catches. So by keeping all the rivers in the game, the system has been sustainable. So if we think about what's the habitat look like that supports these fisheries, we need to think about the fact that the habitat is nested. We have big scale nests, and inside that smaller scale nesting, and inside that even finer scale. So if we look at Bristol Bay here, fish are coming out of the North Pacific and the Bering Sea and returning to rivers in western Alaska. They separate out into their 9 major rivers based on where they were born. Fish are smelling their way home. They're typically spawning in the river that they themselves were born in. And then within each individual river, they separate even further into individual tributaries. And in something like the Wood River, which I'll talk about today, these tributaries and all their populations are genetically distinct. They have been returning there for thousands of years, and they have a local identity to their individual stream. Well, I want to look at the fact that each one of these little dots here, because it still has its natural habitat conditions, every now and then one of these populations will explode and produce numbers of fish that we simply don't see anywhere else in the world. In fact, it's the fact that each one of these dots can explode every now and then and would compensate for dots that don't do well in any given year. It's this portfolio of habitats that provides sustainability. So we're going to look at the Wood River, which is shown here in green, which last year returned about 22.5 million fish to it. And we're just going to put that in the context of how many fish were caught in commercial fisheries globally. So in the lower left here are the fish and game fishing districts, and across all of them, we can see that Bristol Bay sockeye produced almost 60% of the global catch of sockeye salmon last year. That's an impressive number, but that's something we've known about for a while. You know, if you talk about the stronghold for sockeye salmon in the world, it's really Bristol Bay. But let's look at the single fishing district, which is the Nushagak, and carve that out. And what we see is that the Nushagak alone, which is, has 3 major rivers in it, produced about 1/3 of all the sockeye caught globally last year. Now let's look at the Wood River, which is one of the tributaries. It's actually the small tributary that drains into the Nushagak fishing district. And look at what it did last year. Here is catch and escapement since the 1960s, and you can see last year it literally showed one of these little explosions, okay? 22.5 million fish returned to the Wood River. And if we carve that pie up even farther, the little old Wood River, which is maybe a little more than 100 miles long, produced 20% of the global catch of fish of sockeye last year. Well, let's keep digging, okay? Let's look at how did those fish distribute across the Wood River, which is this series of 5 lakes. Each of these lakes is maybe 20 miles long or so. You know, they're big lakes, but they're not enormous. And if we count where did the fish distribute within the Wood River, most of them went back to Lake Beverly, which is this 3rd lake up the system. Locals here call this 3rd lake. This is 1, 2, 3. And it's maybe 15, 16 miles long. It's not that big a lake, but it alone had an escapement of over 4.5 million fish last year. And just to, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words and a movie's worth about 1 million. A movie from a drone is worth about 1 billion, so I'll show you a drone movie here, hopefully. Okay, so this is a beach spawning population on Lake Beverly, taken in early September. Everyone in the room has seen a salmon before. I've spent almost 23 years in Alaska on the spawning grounds looking at fish in Bristol Bay, and I can guarantee you nothing has ever come close to this. Most of the fish that you see balled up there are waiting to spawn. They'll probably spawn about 2 weeks later. A few of them have started to die here, but this lake had these number of fish everywhere. And this is after the fishery took as many as it could. The fishery couldn't keep up with the number of fish returning. And what we're looking at here is balls, balls and balls of fish that are simply waiting to spawn. The production here is simply remarkable, and you would never predict this based on biological principles. So let's carve up the Wood River even farther and ask what proportion returned to Lake Beverly. And 13% of the world's catch of sockeye salmon last year came from this single little lake, Lake Beverly. And Lake Beverly is probably 1% of all the freshwater habitat in western Alaska alone, okay? 1% of western Alaska's habitat, which is probably about 0.01% of the world's habitat of sockeye salmon, and it produced 13% of the global catch. So the message here is small pieces of habitat can really matter. They don't always matter. The long-term average here is pretty low, but in last year, sockeye salmon fisheries were depressed throughout most of the state. Bristol Bay was one of the highlights, and Lake Beverly is what carried the load for a lot of Alaska's fishery catches. So what does this mean? What's the message here when we start asking about what does critical habitat look like? Things like the Kuskokwim River are people who live here are critically dependent on subsistence fisheries for Chinook salmon. There are no roads out here to speak of. This is a remote watershed that's hard to sample and hard to study. And the question is, how can we define where the critical habitat is in a place like the Kuskokwim? And to show you that science is making some progress towards this, just a recent project here that I've been involved with, where the question is of fish caught down in the lower river, for instance, in the Bethel test fishery, these are Chinook. The question is, where did they return? What tributary were they coming from? Were there hotspots within the Kuskokwim? Well, it turns out we can take the otoliths, which are the ear bones out of a fish, we can grind them flat, and then use a laser to zap part of the otolith and determine what the chemistry of that part of the otolith is. And it maps onto a map of what we know the chemistry is across the Kuskokwim River in this case. And we can take a single fish, zap its otolith, and this is the map where the otolith chemistry maps onto the water chemistry. And what we can say with a high degree of certainty is that this fish came from this, oh, you can't see it, okay, darn it. Can't see that either. There you can see it. Okay, so this fish here, we can say with high degree of certainty was produced from this part of the watershed. This was a fish caught a couple years ago. We can add this up for all the fish that we sampled and produce this heat map of where the fish were produced in the Kuskokwim River. And what you can see is that it's not uniform across the river. And the question is, well, can we use a map like this to prioritize the habitat? We're in the process of working up several more years of data, but I'll show you an example from the Nushagak River. Same question, where Chinook salmon are caught in the estuary. You have a ship full of fish, and the question is where throughout the watershed were they produced? And what can we learn about what the habitat, the important habitat is by looking at where the fish were born? So here's the first heat map. These were for fish produced in 2011, and the more intense the red, the more fish that were produced out of that part of the watershed. So you can see that in 2011, there was the hotspot of production up in this northwest part of the watershed, and then this northern tributary, which not surprisingly is called King Salmon River, produced a lot more of the fish. This whole eastern side produced very few fish in 2011. Okay, the tendency might be to look at a map like this and say, well, if we're going to protect habitat, what we should really do is focus on the northwest part of the watershed. And the question is that what we should do? So we went back in 2014, grabbed a bunch of fish, sampled where they came from, and again produced a map of where in the watershed they were produced. So I'll fade into 2014 here, and you can see now that in 2014, those fish that were caught were produced in the northeast part of the watershed. This is the Mulchatna River. And this is Sean Brennan who did this work. Because this took so much effort, I'm gonna wobble between the two, back and forth. And really the message here is that fish habitat is a mosaic of conditions, but the mosaic is continuously changing. And the reason the Nushagak works from the standpoint of maintaining fisheries is that all of its pieces are still there, and the ecosystem is like this living thing. And it interacts with the overriding climate to stabilize production, because in some years, this component of the watershed is strong, and it compensates for another part of the watershed that's not doing well that year. And these two, all the pieces of the watershed compensates for one another. Reason this is interesting, or one of the reasons, is this morning we heard about Pebble Mine. Pebble Mine is proposed to be put in right about here. And if you use 2011 data, you might look at a map like this and say that part of the watershed doesn't support a lot of fish. Well, look at what it did in 2014. So we need to think about the fact that these watersheds and these rivers function as entire ecosystems, not on tributary by tributary basis. So that's really looking at habitat at a coarse spatial scale, big tributaries by big tributaries. Let's look at small spatial scales now and ask, do we still see similar things? And I'll tell you a bit of a story here. This is the work of one of my graduate students who studied coho salmon. Here's a juvenile coho, which lived in a creek called Bear Creek on Lake Aleknagik in the Wood River. And this river, this little stream, is maybe 1.5 miles long from top to bottom. And what's shown in red here are the water temperatures. So in red, it's pretty warm at the top, and then it grades into cool water down at the bottom of the stream. There's groundwater influx that comes in and cools down the stream. The size of the bubble here tells you how many sockeye salmon were spawning in that part of the stream. And basically what you see is that sockeye don't spawn up in the warm water. All the sockeye spawn down here in the cool water before the stream outflows into the lake. This coho has a belly that feels a bit like mine right now after eating lunch, and it's packed full of eggs. It's packed full of sockeye eggs, okay? Most of the growth of this juvenile salmon in its summer is supported by feeding on sockeye eggs. The question is, where did we catch this coho? Well, we caught it up here in the warm water. And the reason for this is that these coho, like any other fish, are cold-blooded. Their body temperatures are the same temperature as the water they're in. And if they eat a belly full of eggs, they can't digest them if they stay in cold water. They have to go find warm water somewhere. So what we guessed was that these fish were up here in the warm reaches of the stream, digesting, and they must be moving downstream into the cold part of the stream to eat eggs and then move back upstream. These are fish about the size of your finger that are migrating 1 mile. And the question is this real, or is this just a fantasy that we're trying to convince ourselves of? So what we did is we put some little antennas out. We split the stream up into the cold site and the warm site, and we put little antennas here halfway through the stream. They look like this, and we can put a little tag in these fish, and if they swim over the antenna picks them up and says, all right, number X32571 crossed the antenna at this time of the day. And then we tagged a bunch of fish up in the warm part of the stream, turned on the antennas and just listened for them, and asked, did any fish that were tagged up in the warm part ever swim downstream a full mile down to the cool water by crossing these two antennae? So here's one of our fish. This is our best behaved fish, but it turns out most of them did this, where they were tagged up in the warm part of the stream. They sat there for about 3 days, and then when the sun went down one night, they headed downstream to the cold part of the stream. Presumably they filled up on eggs, and they turned around and swam back upstream. They stayed there for 3 days. This fish stayed there for 3 days, and then it did it again. Stayed there 4 days, did it again, stayed there 4 days, did it again. So what's going on here is a fish the size of your finger is somehow navigating through this complex world, finding both the temperature resources it needs to digest food and going down to the cold part of the stream to fill up on a big meal of eggs, okay? So in this case, the fish was actually exploiting that variation in the environment. Well, it turns out hydrology modifies that. So we thought we had this great argument that a juvenile coho would exploit warm water for digesting, cold water for feeding, and we studied that in 2007 and 2008, where this red line is the temperature at the top of the stream, the blue line is the temperature at the bottom of the stream, and as you can see, it's much colder. Well, it turns out that 2007 and 2008 were very dry years. And we went to return in 2009 to do it. It rained all summer long. The river was at flood stage all summer, and everything was cold. So I convinced the grad student to stick around another year. We went back and did it in 2010, and it rained again. And there was no temperature variation. Everything was cold. And then we went back in 2011. He got a girlfriend, which kind of slowed him down, luckily. So we went back in 2011, it was another dry summer, and again we got this warm part of the stream at the top, cold at the bottom, and we got this temperature variation again. So based on the story I just told you, during those dry years when there's temperature variation, the fish should have grown really well, and when there was flood years and everything was cold, the fish should have grown really slowly. Well, what happened? They grew well in every year of our study. So we were really scratching our heads here until the shoe dropped. And what we realized happened is that during low water years, there's temperature variation between the top and the bottom of the stream. In wet years, the stream floods and the main channel is all cold. But if it comes up high enough, it spills out of its banks and it warms off-channel wetlands, and they are warm. So during dry years, the fish were moving up in stream to warm up, and during wet years, they were moving off-channel back and forth to binge on eggs in the cold and go warm up on the side channels. So the point is this little stream has all this complexity. We don't know how those fish are navigating it, but we know they're navigating it and exploiting it to their benefit. The habitat really matters, even at fine spatial scales. So when we look at Alaska, we see all of this geomorphic variation. There's mountain ranges, there's flat areas, there's wetlands, there are bogs. And this complexity, as we like to refer to it, is expressed at the scale of the state, at the scale of individual watersheds, and at the scale of little tiny pieces of habitat, even within our smallest streams. So let's go back to the animals again, and I want to show you one more example of how the species that depend on salmon, we know humans depend on salmon, but things like char depend on salmon, bears depend on salmon. Everyone loves bears, so I'll show you some bears. Here's a nice sow brown bear from Bristol Bay. This is in early or late July, I guess. She's scratching on a tree. Her two little cubs are pecking away at her, trying to get a nice feed off of her. And you can see she's pretty skinny, okay? This is before the salmon have returned to the watershed. She's had a long, tough winter, a long, tough spring, because these cubs are sucking her dry, so to speak. And she's waiting for the salmon to show up. By the end of the season, that bear will look something like this. In some cases, it will put on 50% of its body mass in just a couple months. Again, just to show you how happy she is, because she's binged on salmon. See if I can get my pointer back here. She's really happy because she binged on salmon all summer. Her cubs are kind of embarrassed watching her. It's like, what's Mama doing here? Anyhow, she has filled up on salmon all summer long. She's put on all sorts of fat. She's going to go hibernate again. And so salmon are very important here. And if you spent time walking around on salmon streams, one of the things you see in Alaska is a lot of salmon that have been killed by bears. But most of them look like this. Most of them have not been eaten. And the question is, what are these bears doing? Why are they not eating the salmon they're killing? Here's another video of a 400-pound bear killing a salmon. And what did it just eat? It ate one little thing about the size of a marble, and it threw the rest away. What's it doing? That's a beautiful salmon. It should eat the whole thing, right? Well, what it did, that was a male salmon that it captured. All it ate was the brain. Why did it eat the brain? The brain is this little piece of fatty tissue that's very rich in calories and fats. And basically what we think the animal is doing is high grading for the best food possible. If it eats the whole salmon, it's eating muscle and flesh and skin, which just is not as nutritionally valuable as the brain and the eyes of that salmon. So what does that mean? If we think about what's the resource that matters to bears in Bristol Bay, it's not necessarily the number of salmon, it's how long throughout the season it has to feed on salmon. So it's like, imagine, all right, we're here all week, there's a nice lunch buffet every day, they keep bringing us food, we fall asleep by the end of the meal because we're so full. If we do this every day for the week, we're all going to gain a couple pounds, right? Well, so there's all-you-can-eat buffet, and if it's distributed every day over the week, we're going to fill up and put on more weight by the end of the week. If all the you-can-eat buffets were on the same day, and we had to just feed on one day, of course, we would gain less weight. So in the case of bears feeding on salmon, it's not the number of salmon they have access to that's important. It's how long over the course of the season they can feed on salmon that's ultimately important for how fat they can get off feeding on salmon. So let's go back to our watersheds, and here what I'm plotting is the Wood River watershed again. And in this case, each dot is a stream that has a salmon population in it, and the color of the dot is the water temperature. And you can see that some streams are warm, some streams are cold, and that the stream temperature translates into a different spawn timing for each individual tributary. So across the watershed, we have some streams where the fish start spawning in mid-July, and other streams where they're still spawning in October. And that's a reflection of the fact that we have this complexity in the watershed. Some streams are small and draining steep watersheds and full of snowmelt, and they're cold. Fish spawn early there. Later in the season, you have bigger streams and rivers draining flatter watersheds that don't have as much snow in them, and they're warm, and fish spawn late there. So the question is, what do the bears do? Just as a simple example, we can go put a game camera up on a stream, and the blue color here reflects the fact that this is a warm stream. We put the camera up in June. We see no bears on this stream until literally the day the fish enter the stream in middle of July. And then this camera buzzes away, accumulating pictures of bears until the second week of August, and then we see no bears on that stream for the rest of the season. Well, that's a cold stream. Let's compare a few other streams. And what you see is that all the cold streams have bears early in the season, and by September, all of the bears have moved down to the warm streams. So the bears are moving across the landscape, feeding on salmon that are spawning at different times. Birds do the same thing. These are gulls that are scavenging on salmon. We don't have very fancy toys. We just have little game cameras, but on Kodiak Island, the Fish and Wildlife Service has serious toys where they have satellites and they put satellite tags on bears. And they did the same study where they tagged individuals, and each of these lines is an individual across the season, and basically follow any line across. Sorry, go back to my laser pointer. Follow any line across, and you see the colors change. Well, the different colors refer to different habitats that the bear is moving amongst, okay? So over the course of the season, we ask, what are all the bears doing? We like to call them surfing the salmon wave, where the bears are piled up on waterfalls first, where fish are vulnerable. Then they move to small streams where fish are vulnerable, and then those populations go away. Bears move down to rivers, and by October, they're stacked onto lakes where the late spawning fish are active and vulnerable. So the bears are moving across the landscape, exploiting the variation in the landscape. We'd like to think of Kodiak bears as big because there's so many salmon there. I think the answer is Kodiak bears are big because there's lots of salmon, and there's lots of this ecosystem complexity, which extends the time period over which bears can feed on those salmon. So if we go back to the Wood River, whether it's birds or rainbow trout or bears feeding on salmon, they can march their way across the landscape following this variation in when fish are available, okay? So the question is, what does this tell us about how to protect watershed? Well, if we're interested in the time that animals have access to salmon, what we need to do is maintain the diversity and spawn timing that provides them this long period of feeding. And what that means is, what I'm plotting here is the population abundance versus when a certain population spawns. And you can see that all the big populations spawn late. These are rivers and beaches. So if you were to develop a conservation strategy, as is typically done, we usually go and ask, where are the big places? Where are the big producers? And these are what you would protect, and you'd see that they offer very little opportunity to extend the growing season. That if you want to extend the growing season for bears, you need to protect even these little small streams, which don't necessarily hold a lot of fish, but they're available to the consumers early in the season. Uh-oh. Oh. So we need to think about if we are concerned about degrading habitat, we need to maintain the small scale stuff, the small places, as well as the big places and the big rivers, which is typically what we tend to focus on. because it's this variation within watersheds is what ultimately produces productive and reliable salmon returns. And if we think about developing infrastructure, subtle and chronic effects of infrastructure can reduce some of this complexity that we know is important to salmon and we know is important to the wildlife that depend upon it. And to pick one example, this is a satellite image of a road along the Chena River up near Fairbanks. And here's the main river down through here. And through this beautiful imagery, you can see all where the old channel used to be, okay? And it's wandered around across the floodplain here. And fish we know are moving between the main channel and the off-channel habitat, just like they were in Bear Creek. But here this road has cut the two off. There may be culverts that connect the two, but this river can't move anymore, okay? The river is constrained to half the floodplain. So if we look into the future 50 or 100 years, we're taking away options for that river to continue to organize and reorganize itself. We heard about Pebble Mine this morning, and this is just a map to show Bristol Bay and some of the potential threats of mining in this region. And this map is a bit out of date, but the point is simply that there's a lot of habitat here that could be at risk to development of mines. People tend to focus on the big pit and the storage facility. But part of my message here today is the infrastructure build-out that is also part of the risk of developing mines out here, or any infrastructure for that matter. The point is that if we're going to develop infrastructure, let's do it in a smart way and think about maintaining the variation in the habitat, which is what the fish and the wildlife have evolved with for thousands of years. And if we think about comparing, say, Bristol Bay or any of the big rivers in Alaska to what we've done in the lower 48, like the Columbia, you know, it's not even a fair comparison anymore. The Columbia has been stripped of almost all of its variation. Most of the fish are produced out of hatcheries now. We have big dams on the main stem rivers, and we've dammed almost all the small tributaries as well. So now what used to be this tree-like structure that is the river, like we see up here, is now basically a rain gutter. It's a single pipe, fish are pushed through it. Not surprisingly, it's not as productive as it used to be. One of the last things I want to emphasize today is when we think about, well, what is the cost and what is the benefit of protecting habitat, you know, we often lose track of the fact that natural habitat actually produces a lot of jobs, produces livelihoods, supports people's incomes, etc. And there's a useful comparison here to look at the Columbia River, which still supports tribal fisheries. Surprisingly, the Columbia River produces fishery revenues on the order of $300 to $500 million a year. That's a pretty good number. But you look at what is invested in the Columbia River by the taxpayer and by the ratepayer who buys the electricity generated by the dams, it's about $500 million a year. So basically, for every dollar generated from fisheries in the Columbia River, it takes a dollar of investment from the people to support those fisheries. There's basically no net gain. Let's look at Bristol Bay. And this is only for the commercial fishery. I think these numbers would change a little bit, but let's look at the commercial fishery just as a starting point. Fishery revenues at the bare minimum are $200 million a year. If you expand these numbers to account for the fact that the value of the fish grows as it moves through the economy, we're anywhere between $200 and $1.5 billion a year generated from Bristol Bay commercial fisheries. Fish and Game and associated partners costs $5 million a year for science, management, restoration, mitigation, and all those things. In fact, there's no mitigation, there's not much restoration. It's basically the management that takes up $5 million a year. So talk about return on investment. Return on the investment in Bristol Bay is between 40 to 300. I give you $1, you give me $300 back. That's a pretty good deal. I mean, in fact, the state and local governments generate between $15 and $20 million of tax revenue every year off Bristol Bay commercial fisheries. All the state puts in is $5 million. You could argue that ADF&G is underfunded for Bristol Bay, which I think is the case, but this is an amazing investment of state resources. And when we think about what are the costs to developing Bristol Bay watersheds, these type of numbers have to be taken into account. And Alaska's in the remarkably enviable position of trying to figure out what is the future going to look like? How are we going to develop into the future for the good of our kids and our grandkids and our economies, et cetera? We still have all the options up here. Down in the lower 48, most of the options for fish and wildlife are gone, and we're spending billions of dollars trying to get them back. Alaska's in the position where they can make the decisions going forward to develop or not, how to develop, et cetera, and all the options are still there on the table. That luxury passed us in the lower 48 about 100 years ago. And with that, I'm happy that you showed up today, and thanks for your attention. And if you'd like to follow up at all afterwards, please do. Here's my email down here. And I'd like to acknowledge partners and funders, and again, thank you for your attention.
We have a gift for you. You got to stay up here awkwardly for a minute or two. I will have them come up and talk to you afterwards. That's the best way to do it.
Thank you very much. I'm Victoria Demert from Yakutat, and work here with Patricia Cochran, and we're representative of the elders, and very happy to do so, and happy to be here and hearing all of this information with all of you. I was just couldn't take enough notes and worried that I'm missing something, so I'm also recording it. And I'm hoping it's going to be on the website so we can digest it some more. But it's really interesting. And a lot of there's a lot of science that we don't know, but the overall picture that we know is that we need our fisheries, and fish and salmon is life to us. So I just want to thank our speaker for an absolutely informative and so attention-getting speech or discussion that he has for us, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to want to come up and talk to him. We do have a gift. It's a soapstone male dancer with a walrus ivory face from made by Eric Tetpon III. It's absolutely amazing, and it was an amazing talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. That's going to conclude our keynote event for the day. As always, the best way to thank our speakers to come up and talk to them in person. Just a couple reminders. There are 2 more breakout sessions going on after this throughout the day. And tomorrow we meet again here in this room for a discussion with Charles Woolforth, who will be giving us alternatives to life on Earth. I believe that's the title of his talk. So I appreciate if you all be here on time for him in the morning. And we got morning music beginning at 8 o'clock. So we'll see you back in this room at 8 o'clock tomorrow, and we'll see you out in breakout sessions for the next few hours. Thank you all for being here, and look forward to seeing you again in the morning. Thanks.